Before we begin, I need to extend an invitation to you. If you enjoy dark stories, true mysteries and secrets that should never be revealed, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear today is no ordinary story, and it's possible that after this you'll never see certain places the same way again. Oh, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know how far this story is going, and who is prepared to face it until the end. The mansion had remained untouched for decades, built in the middle of an isolated area, surrounded by dense trees and a silence that seemed to absorb any sound. The property carried an invisible weight since 1940. There were no signs, no modern fences, no clear signs of recent abandonment, only the slow wear and tear of time, as if the place had been deliberately forgotten. But it wasn't time that drove people away from there. That's what happened inside her. Daniel Carter never believed in exaggerated stories. An investigative journalist accustomed to debunking myths and exposing lies, he built his career proving that the inexplicable always had a logical explanation. When he received the dossier on the mansion, he treated it as just another case of local folklore. Until you start reading. The records were fragmented, incomplete, pages torn out, names crossed out, dates inconsistent. Still, a pattern repeated itself. Disappearances, all linked to the same night in the winter of 1940. A party, an exclusive event, hosted by a mysterious owner who was never seen again after that night. Guests from different parts of the country attended. None of them returned home. No bodies, no witnesses, no explanations. The police at the time closed the case months later, classifying it as collective abandonment under unknown circumstances. But the residents of the area never accepted that version. For them, something had happened in that house, something that couldn't be explained, and that never went away. Daniel decided to go there, not out of curiosity, but because he found something that no one else seemed to have noticed. Among the old documents was a partially burned photograph. In it, a group of people posed at the entrance of the mansion on the night of the party. Well-dressed men, smiling women, all seemingly normal, except for one detail. In the corner of the image, behind the windows on the upper floor, there was a silhouette. Someone who wasn't in the photo. Someone is watching. And what's most unsettling, the figure didn't match any of the listed guests. Daniel arrived at the property in the late afternoon, when the sky was already beginning to lose its light. The dirt road leading to the mansion seemed little used, with old tire tracks almost erased by nature. Upon parking, he remained inside the car for a few seconds, observing. The structure was larger than I had imagined. Tall windows, many of them broken. The main door still standing, but marked by time. No sign of electricity, no movement. Still, something was wrong. Silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if the atmosphere was contained, as if something was waiting there. Daniel grabbed his camera, recorder, and a flashlight. As he got out of the car, the gravel creaked beneath his feet, the only sound in that empty space. He approached the entrance. The door was ajar. That didn't make sense. According to the records, the mansion had been sealed off decades ago. No recent inspections, no official visits. Even so, someone had been there. Or it still was. Daniel pushed the door open slowly. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, antique furniture covered in dust but intact. A huge chandelier hung in the center of the main hall, slightly tilted. Pictures on the walls were still aligned, though darkened by time. And then he saw marks on the floor, light scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged recently. His heart raced, not from fear but from alert. That wasn't just an old story. There was activity there. He started recording. Entry onto the property at 5:42 p.m. Internal structure preserved. Possible signs of recent presence. Her voice sounded strange in the room, muffled, almost swallowed by the walls. He took a few more steps, and then he heard A sound, weak, distant, like a slow, dragging sound coming from upstairs. Daniel froze. The sound stopped. Silence again. He looked at the staircase. For a moment, he considered leaving. Coming back another day with support, with a team, with daylight. But there was something stronger than the instinct for caution. The feeling that if he left now, he would lose his only chance to find out the truth. And Daniel Carter was not the type of person to back down. He started to climb. Step by step, the sound of the wood echoed softly. Each step seemed louder than it should have been. The air grew colder as he advanced. At the top of the stairs, a long corridor stretched out ahead. Doors closed on both sides, one of them slightly open, and from inside her came that same sound. This is it. Dragged, like something being moved, or someone trying to move. Daniel raised the lantern. The light flickered slightly in his hand. He approached the door. He pushed, and at that moment, the sound stopped completely, as if he knew he was there. The room was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no objects, no immediate sign of where that sound could have come from. Just the worn wooden floor and subtle marks. Irregular lines cutting across the floor, as if something had been dragged repeatedly over the years, or just a few minutes ago. Daniel entered slowly, keeping the flashlight steady. The air inside was different, heavier, colder. He took a few steps, analyzing the surroundings with the trained eye of someone who had been in abandoned places before. But there was something there that didn't fit. It wasn't just abandonment. It wasn't neglect. It was unintentional preservation, as if that space had been interrupted in time. He bent down, running his fingers along one of the marks on the ground. The dust around it had accumulated, but the scratch itself seemed more recent. That confirmed it. Someone, or something, had been there recently. Daniel stood up quickly and began to examine the walls more closely. That's when he noticed something almost imperceptible, small, vertical cracks near the opposite corner of the room. Too ordinary to be natural. He approached. He ran his hand over it and he pressed. A soft click echoed. The wall gave way a few centimeters. A hidden compartment. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling for the first time a slight, genuine discomfort. This was no longer just a journalistic investigation. There was intent behind that construction. Someone designed that place to hide things, and hide it well. He carefully pulled the structure. Behind her, there was a narrow space, almost like a makeshift safe inside the wall, and inside it, documents, several, yellowed, fragile but preserved. Daniel placed the flashlight on the ground and began to carefully leaf through the material. They were old records, some with dates predating 1940. Names, lists, short notes, almost like codes. But one detail caught his attention immediately. The names were not random. They were influential people. Businessmen, politicians, investors, prominent figures of the time, all connected to the same date, the night of the party. Daniel continued analyzing until he found something even more unsettling, a diary, small, dark-covered with handwritten pages. The handwriting was firm and controlled. It most likely belonged to the owner of the mansion. He began to read. The first few pages talked about construction, property expansion, land acquisitions. Everything seemed normal. But as it progressed, the tone changed. The structures are almost ready. Below the house, the space is responding as expected. Daniel frowned. Below the house, he continued. The guests were chosen with care. Each one of them brings something essential. The discomfort began to grow. That was no simple social gathering. It was planned. They don't know. None of them know. And that's essential. Daniel turned the page more quickly. The night will be the beginning, not an end. He stopped. The silence around them seemed more intense now, as if the environment were reacting to what he was discovering. And then, one detail made his body freeze. There was one last note on that page, written in a different way, less controlled, almost rushed. If anyone finds this, do not open the lower level. Daniel slowly closed the diary. Lower level. That explained a lot, and at the same time made everything worse. The mansion was not just the setting, it was part of something bigger. He stood up, looking around with new eyes. That house didn't just hide an event from the past, it was hiding an entire structure. And maybe whatever had happened to those people was still there. A crackling sound echoed down the hallway. Daniel turned his head quickly. Steps. This time there was no doubt. Slow steps, dragged, coming from outside the room. He instinctively turned off the flashlight. The atmosphere plunged into darkness. The sound continued, closer. He stopped right in front of the door. Daniel held his breath. The door, which he had left ajar, it started to move. Very slowly, as if she were being pushed by someone on the other side. The door opened a few more centimeters, slowly, no rush, as if whoever was on the other side knew exactly the effect it was causing. Daniel remained motionless, completely enveloped in darkness. His heart pounded, but his mind raced. This couldn't be explained by wind. There wasn't enough of an air current, and the movement was too controlled, too human, or almost. The crack in the door revealed only a dark hallway. No clear silhouettes, no audible breathing, but there was a presence. He could feel it. Holding the recorder firmly, Daniel turned it on again, keeping his voice low. Possible intruder on the second floor. Movement detected at the door. No visual confirmation. The wood creaked. One step. Inside the room. Daniel froze. The sound was unmistakable now. Someone had entered. Without thinking, he turned his body quickly and lit the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the room. Nothing. The room remained empty. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the absence of someone. It was the fact that the door was now wide open, and the marks on the ground had changed. Daniel stared intently. The trailing lines now extended to the center of the room, as if something had been pulled away. While he was standing there, his instincts finally began to scream louder. That was more than just a dangerous investigation. It was a mistake. Even so, he did not back down, because now there was something even more urgent, the lower level. If that place held any answers or any concrete proof, it would be down there. Daniel left the room with quick but controlled steps. The hallway seemed longer than before. The closed doors now looked different, almost as if they were misaligned, slightly open, watching. He ignored it. He went down the stairs. The main hall was exactly as before, still silent, but not empty. The feeling of presence was stronger, closer. He started searching. Kitchen, nothing. Sala lateral, nothing, until he found it. A door partially hidden behind an old cabinet, almost invisible. Locked up, but with clear signs of recent use. Daniel pushed the piece of furniture with effort. The wood scraped the floor, its sound echoing through the house like a warning. He hesitated for a second, so he opened the door. A damp, heavy smell immediately escaped. Steps descending into darkness, the lower level. Daniel pointed the flashlight downwards. The steps were narrow, old, and marked. The same drag marks, going down, always going down. He started to go down. Each step felt colder than the last. The air grew thick, making it difficult to breathe. The flashlight's light seemed to fade, as if being swallowed by the atmosphere. Halfway there, a sound. Now it's clearer, closer, breathing, slow, irregular, coming from below. Daniel stopped, his whole body tensed, but instead of going up, he kept going down. When it reached the last step, the flashlight finally revealed the space. It was bigger than I expected, much bigger, a kind of expanded basement, almost like a hidden hall, and at its center, currents, fixed to the ground. Some are still attached to metal structures, others broken. Daniel stepped forward, completely focused on the scene. That wasn't symbolic. He was a physicist, real. Someone was being held there, several people, against their own will. And then he saw marks on the walls, risks, counts, like days being marked, or desperate attempts to avoid losing one's sanity. The air grew even heavier, and the breathing more audible, much closer. Daniel turned the flashlight slowly. And then the light stopped, deep in space. Something moved one way, low, disfigured by the shadow, but long live. The breath came from there. He tried to focus the light better, and for a second, things seemed to recede, as if he were afraid, or as if she didn't want to be seen. Daniel took another step. "Is anyone there?" His voice came out firmer than he expected. Silence. Then a sound. Not a word, but something close to that, like a forgotten attempt to speak. And at that moment, the flashlight blinked. Once, two, and then it went dark. Darkness engulfed everything. And for the first time since entering the mansion, Daniel realized he was not in control of the situation. Darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was a presence, dense, oppressive, alive. Daniel stood completely still, trying to control his breathing. His eyes wouldn't adjust. There was nothing to adjust. It was absolute blackness, as if the space around him had ceased to exist. But the sound continued. That irregular, labored breathing was still there, closer now. Instinctively, Daniel took a step back. His foot bumped into something metallic. Currents. The sound echoed through the room, and immediately, breathing stopped. Total silence. Heavy, unnatural. Daniel pressed the flashlight button several times. Nothing. Complete failure. His heart raced. He reached into his pocket, trying to find his cell phone. When he finally did, the screen lit up, emitting a faint bluish light that barely reached a few meters ahead. But it was enough to see that he wasn't alone. The currents on the ground were moving slightly, not because of him, but as if something had just passed by there. Daniel slowly raised the light. The space seemed bigger now, or perhaps something deeper. The walls were further away than before. And then he noticed something he hadn't seen with the flashlight. Doors. Several. Distributed along the walls of the basement. Small, metallic, like makeshift cells. Some are open, others closed. He approached the nearest one. The door was ajar. Carefully he pushed. The creaking was long and painful. Within, nothing. But the walls were covered in marks. Vertical lines drawn repeatedly, counting the days. Or escape attempts. In the corner, something else. Words. Written with difficulty. He observes. Daniel swallowed hard. That was not part of a myth. Someone was there. Vivo, conscious, and scared. He walked away slowly, passing through the next door. Closed, locked from the outside. He hesitated, but it pulled. Nothing, locked. And then a sound came from inside, very low, almost imperceptible, like fingernails lightly scraping the other side of the door. Daniel froze. That was impossible. Decades had passed. There was no way anyone could be alive in there. But the sound, it continued. Scraping, insistent. He took a step back. And that's when another piece started to fall into place. The diary, the structures are ready. The space is responding as expected. That was not just captivity. It was an experiment. But for what purpose? Control, resistance, or something worse? Daniel began to spin slowly, illuminating the surroundings with his cell phone. And then he realized something even more disturbing. In the center of the underground, where before there were only chains, there was a symbol engraved on the ground, big, deep, almost erased by time, but still visible. It wasn't decorative, it was functional. The chains were positioned around him, as if that were the central point of everything. Daniel approached, kneeling down to get a better look. Complex geometric lines, interconnected. You need it. It didn't seem improvised. It seemed to have been planned with extreme care. And then he saw another detail. Small notches around the symbol. Names. The same names as on the list. One for each brand. One for each person present that night. The air grew even heavier. That wasn't just confinement. It was ritualistic. Or something that imitated a ritual, but without any known reference. Without traditional religious symbols. No recognizable pattern. It was fitting. Raised there for something specific. A new sound cut through the room, this time coming from behind him. Steps, quick, dragged, moving. Daniel stood up immediately, turning his body around. The light from the cell phone flickered in his hand. For a second, he saw a silhouette passing between the columns in the basement, high, disproportionate, moving erratically, too fast, and then he disappeared. Silence returned. But not entirely, because now there was more than one breath, Daniel realized. It wasn't just one thing down there, it never was. And the worst detail began to form in his mind. If those doors were cells, and some were open, so whatever was trapped there, it wasn't there anymore. A metallic sound echoed behind him. One of the doors. It had just closed itself off, with force. Daniel turned slowly, and at that moment he understood something that completely changed the situation. He wasn't exploring that place. He had entered a system that was still active. The sound of the metal door slamming shut echoed like a final blow. It was no coincidence. It wasn't the wind. That thing reacted. Daniel took a step back, trying to reorganize his thoughts. His breathing was short, forced to be controlled. The cell phone trembled slightly in his hand, casting unsteady shadows on the basement walls. And then, another sound. A second door closed, stronger, closer. The pattern was clear now. Something was moving there. And not only that, I was driving. Daniel turned slowly, trying to anticipate any movement. But the environment seemed to change along with him. The shadows didn't remain fixed. The spaces seemed to rearrange themselves as he moved, and then he noticed something that made his whole body freeze. The symbol on the ground. It wasn't the same anymore. The lines appeared deeper, more vivid, as if they had been reactivated. He instinctively moved closer, and that's when he saw it. At the center of the symbol, there was something that hadn't been there before, an object, small, dark. He bent down, bringing the light closer. It was a key, old, heavy, with details reminiscent of the same geometric shapes as the symbol. Daniel hesitated. Everything in that place screamed at him not to touch anything, but there was another, stronger truth. That system required interaction. He was not an observer. It was part of that now. Slowly, he picked up the key. The instant his fingers touched the metal, a deep sound echoed throughout the basement, like something moving. Inside the walls, the currents vibrated, the doors shook, and then a scream. Not human, but close enough to be recognized as pain. Daniel stepped back, looking around in a state of high alert. The metal doors began to react. Some are opening slowly, others are closing down violently. It was as if the place was choosing. And then he listened. Absolute clarity for the first time. A voice, low, dragged, behind him. "You opened." Daniel turned around immediately. The light from the cell phone found something. Somebody. A figure leaning against the wall, partially illuminated. Too skinny. Pale skin, almost grey. Deep-set eyes, but lively. Wearing remnants of what were once formal clothes, like the party guests. Daniel was speechless for a second. "You are alive?" he asked, almost in disbelief. The figure took a step forward. The movement was strange, stiff, as if the body wasn't used to moving. "No, as you understand," his voice was failing. "Ravine, but consciously." Daniel tried to soothe. "How long have you been here?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if the question didn't make sense. "Time doesn't work down here." The air felt colder, denser. Daniel tightened his grip on the key in his hand. What happened here? The figure took another step closer, now fully visible. And that's when Daniel saw the most disturbing detail of all. The face. He acknowledged it. He was one of the men in the photograph. One of the guests from 1940. Exactly the same. No aging, no change. Imprisoned in that state. The figure's eyes were fixed on the key. He needed us. Daniel swallowed hard. Who? The answer came almost as a whisper. The owner. Never left. The ground seemed to vibrate slightly, as if the mansion itself were reacting to that statement. Daniel felt the weight of the situation change completely. That wasn't about disappearance, not even about death. It was about permanence. Something about that house kept the people there, preserved, but not intact. The figure slowly raised its hand, pointing to one of the metal doors at the bottom of the basement. Unlike the others, bigger, lattice, covered by the same geometric shapes as the symbol. Is there? Daniel looked in the indicated direction. He felt an immediate urge to retreat, but the figure remained. You brought the key. Silence. Heavy. Final. Now, he can leave. Daniel's heart raced. No, I'm not going to open that. The figure tilted its head again, this time with something different. Almost a smile. Sad or resigned. Have you opened it yet? A deep sound echoed again, this time coming from the sealed door. This is it. Heavy, like something unlocking from within. The key in Daniel's hand began to heat up. The lines of the symbol on the ground glowed faintly, and at that moment he understood. The door did not need to be opened manually. She just needed someone who would agree to join the system. And he did it. The moment he turned the key, the entire basement began to vibrate. The non-existent lights seemed to pulse, and from the sealed door, the first impact came. Something hit from the other side, with force, then another one, stronger, and another, as if something was trying to get out. After decades of waiting, Daniel took a step back, but it was too late. The turning point had been reached. That was no longer an investigation. It was a liberation. The impact on the sealed door suddenly ceased, and the silence that followed was worse, much worse. Daniel didn't move. The cell phone still illuminated the room unevenly, but now the light seemed weaker, as if it were being drained or consumed. The figure before him, the man in the photograph, also stopped. His gaze, previously fixed on the door, was now turned toward Daniel, more aware, more present. You feel it now, he murmured. Daniel tightened the key forcefully. What? The response came slowly. He woke up. A deep sound echoed throughout the entire basement. It wasn't an impact. It wasn't physical movement. It was a vibe, like something enormous breathing for the first time in a long time. The walls responded. The scratched marks began to fragment. Small pieces of wood and dust fell from the ceiling, and then the other figures began to emerge. First, shadows, then shapes, emerging from the darkest areas of the subsoil, from inside the open cells, from behind the columns, dragging itself along, getting up, observing. Daniel turned slowly. Now he could see. There were several, all different, but they are alike in one detail. None of them seemed completely human. Bodies preserved, but altered. Erratic movements, empty stares, until they focused on him. In the key, the man in front of her took another step. We tried to resist. Another sound came from the sealed door, stronger, closer. Something heavy is being dragged from the other side. But he'll learn. Daniel began to back away. What is this? What's inside? The man answered without hesitation. What sustains us? A loud bang. This time, part of the door gave way slightly. A crack, dark, but profound. And from her, something came out. Not a form, not a body, but a presence, like smoke, but dense, heavy. Viva. Daniel felt it immediately. The air got colder. It's harder to breathe. His thoughts began to fail, confused, fragmented. The figures around them reacted, not afraid, but with submission, as if that were inevitable. Some knelt down, others simply stopped moving, waiting. The man standing before Daniel also lowered his head. "He is coming back to us." Daniel took another step back. His eyes were fixed on the crack. That thing was expanding, slowly, as if it were testing the waters, recognizing the environment after decades in prison. "No," Daniel murmured, almost without realizing it, but his mind had already understood. That was something that could not be contained again, not in the same way. He looked at the key, still warm, pulsating slightly, as if she were connected to it, and then a memory. The diary. "Do not open the bottom level." Too late. Another crack echoed. Another part of the door broke off. Now the opening was wide enough to see beyond. But Daniel didn't want to, because he felt it. "If you looked directly, I wouldn't be able to leave there anymore." The figures began to move again, but now towards him. Tapes, coordinates, no rush. As if they knew he had nowhere else to go. The man raised his face one last time, and this time there was something new in his expression. Relief. "Now you understand." Daniel shook his head, taking another step back. "There has to be a way to stop this." Silence. So the final answer. "He has." A pause, the sound behind them growing louder. The presence is expanding, and then, "But someone has to stay." Daniel froze. The meaning was immediate, full, unquestionable. The system was still working, but I needed something, or someone, to keep what was inside contained. He looked around, for the figures, for the symbol, to the door. And finally, for the exit. Distant, dark, but it's still possible. Or that was it, or to replace those who had been imprisoned there since 1940. The sound behind him grew louder, stronger, closer, and for the first time since entering the mansion, Daniel hesitated for real, not out of fear, but by choice. The sound behind Daniel was no longer just a presence, it was progress. Slow, but inevitable. With each passing second, the opening in the sealed door grew wider. The darkness escaping from within no longer seemed like just a phenomenon. It molded itself, adapted, as if learning the space around it. Daniel took a deep breath, once, two, forcing the mind to emerge from the chaos. He'd been in extreme situations before. He'd faced lies, crimes, dangerous people. But this couldn't be dealt with in the same way. There was no direct confrontation. There was no traditional logic. There was a system. And systems could be understood. He looked again at the symbol on the ground. The lines, the names, the currents, everything was connected. That was more than just a prison. It was a containment mechanism, and he had activated it. Daniel knelt down again, ignoring the slow movement of the figures around him. His eyes were now analyzing, not reacting. "He'll learn." The man's words echoed in his mind. If you learned, then you reacted. If it reacted, then it depended on stimuli. And if it depended on, he could have been deceived. The sound behind him grew louder, closer, but Daniel remained, observing, thinking. He placed the key over the symbol. Nothing happened. Then he changed. He placed the key on one of the carved names. A slight vibration ran through the floor, small, but it's real. "It's not just a matter of opening it," he murmured. The figures around them began to stir slightly, as if they noticed something. Daniel quickly began connecting the dots. Every name, every position, every brand, that was a pattern, a sequence, a circuit. The guests weren't there by chance. They were part of the structure, part of how it works. "He needed you," Daniel repeated, now understanding. Not as random victims, but as pieces. He picked up the key again. His gaze swept over the walls, through the cells, by name, and then he realized not all of them were marked. Some of the names on the ground were incomplete, or deleted, or missing. And then came the final understanding. The system was broken, incomplete. That's why it was unstable. That's why he was able to get out. Daniel stood up quickly. "How many were there?" he asked the man. The response came almost automatically. "Doze." Daniel looked around. He told his story. 1, 2, 3, new. There were only 9 figures there. 3 were missing, 3 points in the system. 3 pieces are missing. He turned his gaze back to the symbol. 3 spaces were unlit, inactive. "That's it," he said now with certainty. The man watched him in silence. Daniel turned the key again. "We don't need someone new." He paused, feeling the weight of one's own conclusion. "You need to complete the pattern." A loud bang came from the door. This time, an entire section collapsed. The darkness advanced further, now occupying a larger area of the subsoil. The air became almost unbreathable. The figures began to recede, not out of fear, but as if they were being pulled. Daniel acted. He ran to one of the open cells. Inside there were still chains attached. He pulled. Heavy, but furniture. He dragged it to the symbol, then another one, and one more. Each movement required effort, but he ignored the strain. Time was running out. "Get in position!" he shouted. The figures did not react immediately, but then one of them took a step, then another one, as if something inside them was still responding. I still understood. The man was the first to move. He walked slowly towards the symbol. He stopped at one of the marked points. The others started to follow. One by one, they are positioning themselves, as if they remembered, as if that had already been done before. Daniel quickly adjusted the chains, connecting them to the empty positions, but there were still 3 more to go. He stopped. Heavy breathing. He looked at the remaining spaces, and then he made the decision. Without hesitation, he positioned himself in one of them. He placed the chain around his own wrist. The cold metal pressed against his skin. The symbol reacted immediately. A stronger vibration ran through the floor. The lines began to light up. 2 more to go, he said, looking around. The man stared at him, and then he nodded, slowly, as if he understood, as if he accepted it. 2 other figures stepped forward. They stopped at the remaining stops. The currents closed. The system, it began to come together. The darkness that was emanating from the door hesitated for the first time, as if it were encountering resistance. Daniel felt it. Something has changed. He was no longer just inside that. Now it was part of it. The sound behind him faded slightly. It didn't stop. But he backed down. Enough. Perhaps. Maybe. If only there was a way to contain it. But the price, it was already being paid for. The symbol pulsed beneath Daniel's feet. This is it. Like an old heart starting to beat again after decades. The lines etched into the ground now glowed with an uneven intensity, connecting each of the 12 points, each figure, each chain, each position finally occupied. The system was almost complete, but not stable, not yet. Daniel felt it in his own body. The chain attached to her wrist wasn't just physical. There was something more, an internal pressure, as if her mind was being pulled into that pattern, forced to synchronize with something greater, older, more conscious. He closed his eyes for a moment, and then he saw fragments, images that were not his. The mansions is new, illuminated, people arriving, laughter, music at a party. The 12 guests gathered in the main hall, and in the center, a man, elegant, property, observing, not as a host, but like someone who was waiting. The vision intensified. It changed. The subsoil, the currents, the same 12. But now they're prisoners, confused, trying to understand. And the man, still there, observing, no rush, without emotion. Daniel opened his eyes abruptly, panting. He never wanted guests, she murmured. The man next to him, the same one from the photograph, raised his face slightly. The mechanism. Another violent impact came from the sealed door, much stronger. The entire structure shook. A large part gave in. It was no longer a crack, it was an opening. And from there, darkness began to pour out like a thick liquid, slowly spreading across the floor, stopping when touching the limits of the symbol, stepping back for a moment. As if testing the barrier, Daniel clenched his teeth. It's not complete yet. The lines were shaking. They fluctuated. Something was wrong. He looked around. He counted again. 12 positions, 12 bodies. Everything seemed fine. But it wasn't enough. And then he realized the figures. They were there, but not entirely present. Some were trembling. Others seemed to disappear for a few moments. Unstable, as if they weren't completely anchored. "They're not whole," Daniel said. The man replied with difficulty, "We were fragmented." Darkness advanced once more, this time slightly exceeding one of the lines of the symbol. One of the points missed by a second. The figure there screamed, a distorted sound, and part of it simply disappeared. Pull, consumed. Daniel reacted immediately. "No!" He pulled on the chain, trying to maintain a steady position. But it wasn't physical. It was structural. "What else is missing?" he shouted. The man turned his face slowly and pointed to his head. "Memory!" Daniel froze for a moment, and then he understood. It wasn't enough to just occupy the seats. It was necessary to be. Each one of them needed to be complete, present, conscious. Part of the standard, but they weren't. Decades there had erased who they were. The structure was incomplete because they were incomplete. Another impact, stronger. The darkness advanced further. Now touching on 2 points, the lines started failing in sequence. The system was collapsing. Daniel took a deep breath, fast, forced, and then he made a desperate decision. He closed his eyes again, and he concentrated. If that place functioned with memory, so he needed to provide it. He thought about photography, in the names, in the stories, in the records. He forced his mind to rebuild, faces, details, contexts, one by one. "You were a businessman," he said to the man next to him. "New York, railroad investments." The figure reacted, slightly. The body stabilized for a second. The lines beneath her feet shone even brighter. It worked. Daniel continued, turning to another. "You came from Chicago." The industrial sector, another glimmer of light. Another point stabilized, but time was running out. The darkness was now advancing faster. The opening in the door was already large enough to let something bigger through, something more defined. A shape was beginning to form inside her. Daniel accelerated. Name after name, story after story, forcing every fragment of identity back into those figures. Some reacted, others don't. And every mistake was costly. One point has completely disappeared. The figure there was pulled without resistance. Undone, the system shook violently. "There's not enough time," Daniel murmured, but he didn't stop, because now there was only one option. Either he finished it, or everything would work out. The form in the opening finally moved, more defined, denser, almost human, but wrong, with proportions that didn't fit together, with movements that were too calculated. She stopped at the edge of the door, as if observing, waiting. Daniel looked directly at it, even knowing that I shouldn't. And at that moment, he felt it. He recognized that as well. And then he smiled. No face. Expressionless, but unmistakably conscious. The climax was about to begin. Attendance at the opening finally went ahead. No rush. Absolutely. Every movement was precise, controlled, as if that space had always belonged to her. Daniel remained firmly on the spot, marked by the symbol. The chain attached to his wrist no longer caused physical pain. It was something deeper now. His mind was connected to that system, forced to sustain something he could barely comprehend. But he didn't look away. Even knowing that it was a mistake, the shape before him began to take on a clearer form as it partially crossed the threshold of the door. A body, high, elegant, traces of something human, but distorted, like an imperfect version of someone who once existed. And then the face. For a brief moment, he appeared, and Daniel recognized it. He was the same man from the memoirs. The host of the party, the owner of the mansion, exactly as in the visions, no aging, no changes, as if time had never touched him. The entity tilted its head slightly, observing Daniel, analyzing. "You don't fit the mold," the voice echoed. It didn't come out of his mouth. It came from everywhere at once. Daniel clenched his teeth. "And you shouldn't exist." Silence. And then, the organization has taken another step. The symbol reacted immediately. The lines lit up with full intensity. An invisible barrier formed, and for the first time, she stopped. The entity observed the ground, then the others, the figures trapped in the chains. "Incomplete," she said. Daniel replied with effort, "Enough." The entity tilted its head again, curious. "Do you believe that?" Daniel did not answer, because he knew. They weren't enough. The system was still unstable. One of the stops was empty. The figure that had been consumed could not be completely replaced. The structure was failing. And the entity knew. She slowly raised her hand. And then one of the points on the symbol has faded, instantly, as if it had been switched off. The line connecting that point broke. The system has weakened. The organization has taken another step. Now, half of the body was already outside the door. Daniel felt the direct impact. It was as if something was pressing down on his mind from the inside out. My thoughts began to fail. Memories mixing together. He was being invaded. "I can complete it," the entity said. Daniel forced himself to concentrate. "You destroy. I transform." Another point failed. Another figure has disappeared. The system collapsed in sequence. Daniel realized he couldn't keep doing that. Not like that. Not with what was left. Then came the final decision, quick, irreversible. He let go of the chain. The metal fell to the ground with a dry sound. The symbol reacted violently, more unstable than ever. The entity paused for a moment. Curious, interested. Daniel stepped forward, leaving the position, entering the center of the symbol, right at the core. "Do you want to finish?" he said, his voice firm. The entity observed it. Absolute silence. "Then do it right." Daniel held up the key, now shining brightly, as if he had been waiting for it. "You depend on this." The organization did not respond, but the entire environment reacted. The lines vibrated, the current shifted. Everything is connected. Everything is converging. Daniel tightened the key forcefully, and then she carved it into the center of the symbol. The effect was immediate, violent. The entire ground seemed to break apart. The lines exploded in light. Currents were tightened to the maximum. The remaining figures screamed, but not from pain, of rupture. The system was not being restored. It was being reconfigured. The entity moved forward, this time with force, trying to cross completely. But it was too late. The symbol has changed. The connections were reversed, the flow stopped, and then the entity was pulled, not forward, but downwards, back. The distorted form tried to resist, writhing, expanding, but something bigger now held her captive, something new, something that didn't exist before. Daniel, he was no longer just connected. He was the core, the central point, the replacement. But unlike the others, he entered by choice. Conscious, controlling. "Now you stay," Daniel said with effort. The organization tried to move forward once again, but the system pulled her in with full force. The opening began to close, darkness being compressed, forced back, the last thing that remained visible. It was the face, still observing, still conscious. And then it disappeared. The door was sealed. With a final impact, silence returned. But it wasn't the same. The chains fell. The remaining figures slowly disappeared, as if they had never been there. The basement was empty. Except for one thing, at the center of the symbol, Daniel was still standing, property, eyes open but different, deep, fixed, and the key, now it was part of him. The mansion fell silent again, but not to abandonment. Days later, the location was finally found, not by chance. Daniel Carter's car remained parked on the dirt road, exactly where he had left it. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, no immediate indication of danger. The police were called. Teams entered the property, and at first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The structure was still standing, the interior old but preserved. Dust, intact furniture, a total absence of recent signs of activity. No signs of forced entry, no human presence, except for one detail. The recorder, found on the floor of the main hall, still working. The recording was subsequently analyzed. The first few hours were normal, technical narrations, detailed observations, the kind of record-keeping that Daniel always did in his investigations. But then, the audio files kept changing. Noises, interferences, silences that are too long, and finally, fragments. It's not abandonment. They are still below. After that, just static. The search continued for hours. Nothing. Until they found the hidden door behind the cupboard. It wasn't open, not out of place at all. It seemed intact, as if it had never been touched. But when forced, the stairs appeared, going down to the basement. The team hesitated, but it went down. The space down there, it was empty. Completely empty. No chains, no cells, without symbols, without any evidence that anything had ever existed there. Just raw concrete, like an unfinished basement. No marks, no story, with nothing. It was as if the place had been erased. The investigation was closed days later, classified as a disappearance without concrete evidence. Another unsolved case. Another name added to a growing list of stories that no one could fully explain, but not everyone accepted that conclusion. One of the investigators, one who paid close attention to detail, noticed something that wasn't in the official report, something small, but impossible to ignore. In the center of the underground, there was only one brand, almost invisible, one line, letter, it needs. Like a deep scratch in the concrete, and next to her, an object, old, dark, metallic, a key, but not an ordinary key. She seemed incomplete, as if part of her were missing, or worse, as if part of her were somewhere else. The key was retrieved, listed, and kept as evidence, but that same night, it disappeared. No record, without explanation, no forced access. It simply disappeared. Days later, reports began to emerge. Residents of the area claimed to hear sounds coming from the mansion again, steps, drags, beats, and sometimes something else. A dim light streamed through the upstairs windows, as if someone were inside, observing, waiting. The property was isolated again. This time, there is no intention of reopening the case. I have no interest in investigating further. Because even without concrete proof, there was a common feeling among everyone who had come into contact with that place. Something had been contained, but not destroyed, and somehow that was now stable. The mansion was still standing, silent, intact, but not empty. Never empty. Because at the deepest point of that place, where no brand should exist, where no structure should remain, something was still maintaining the balance, something that wasn't there before, something that chose to stay. And now, it was part of the mansion itself. Years later, the mansion remains untouched. No buyers, no real attempt at demolition, just silence and distance. But occasionally, someone comes closer. Curious, explorers, people who don't believe the stories, and almost always they report the same thing. Upon entering the main hall, they feel watched, Not in a vague way, but be direct. It needs, as if someone were exactly where they should be, waiting. And sometimes, when the late afternoon light streams through the upstairs windows, a silhouette can be seen. Stop, property, with something reflecting in the hand, something metallic, small, and perfectly aligned with the body, as if he had never been left behind, as if now it was part of him. And now I ask you a question. If you were in Daniel's place, would you have made the same decision? Would you have the courage to stay, knowing that you might never leave again? Or would I have chosen to flee, even at the risk of unleashing something that should never have existed? Stories like this make us wonder how far we would go to uncover the truth, and what price we would be willing to pay for it. If this story captivated you until the end, write it in the comments below. I wouldn't open the door, or I would face it to the end. And tell me too, where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even more disturbing, and maybe much closer to reality than you imagine.